All right, welcome everybody to the Columbia Games GenCon 2020 session on Introduction to HârnWorld. I'm Brent Bailey, and co-presenting with me will be Marc Renouf. So today, the purpose of today's session is to give you an overview of the HârnWorld setting so that you can use it with whatever rule set, role-playing game rule set that you are wanting to. We'll give you an overview of the HârnWorld setting, the HârnWorld product line from Columbia Games, and give you some tips on how the setting can be used with other types of rules. So first off, what is HârnWorld? So the HârnWorld setting was designed from 1983, a system-neutral setting for fantasy role-playing games. It's originally, back in the day, it was, Dungeons and Dragons, but there were other games that were starting to come out at the time. But there was very little in the way of material. And so Columbia Games and N. Robin Crosby, who was the original designer of Harn, started publishing the HârnWorld setting material back then, with the idea that it was a detailed and realistic setting, but also flexible. There are elements in the HârnWorld setting of 9th through 14th century Britain and Europe, but there's also a mixture of common fantasy elements such as dwarves and elves and orcs and magic and that sort of thing. The setting is designed for and is usable for pretty much any style of medieval or fantasy adventure or campaigns, and we'll be getting into a number of examples of how that works in a little while. Couple things to know about the HârnWorld setting is that every product published since 1983 has been set at a fixed point in time. So in the game world, it's the year 720. So all the material that has been published since day one makes the same assumptions as to when the world is at that point. So there's no advancing the clock. There's no metagame in terms of, we're not publishing anything that will advance that timeline. So you as a user, as a customer, know that when you're buying something that it's compatible with pretty much everything that has been published to date. And that consistency across the products, across the material, is something that Harn fans really appreciate. So a lot of people, when you talk about Harn, also have heard about Harn Master. So what's HârnWorld? What's Harn Master? What is Harn? So if HârnWorld is the setting, Harn Master are the rules designed for fantasy role-playing. And they are a separate product from HârnWorld. So Columbia Games, after putting out the setting, decided, well, let's put out our own rules that are really compatible with that setting. So although the Harn Master rules were designed for use with the HârnWorld setting, it can be used to run adventures in other settings as well. We're not going to talk much at all about Harn Master in this session. There's plenty of places you can find out more about that. Columbia Games website has a lot more about it, but we're really going to be talking today just about the HârnWorld setting. So what is Harn? Harn's an island about 100 miles off the northwest coast of a continent. So in this lower map here, I'm showing this is the continent of Lithia. And if you kind of squint your eyes a bit, you can kind of figure that, well, it's vaguely in this area, something like Europe, and here's something like the Mediterranean and something like Africa and the Middle East and the East. So the HârnWorld setting was designed to be fairly similar to the real world, so that you as a GM, if there's something that you don't know about the HârnWorld setting, you can kind of make it up based on what you know about the real world. So the island of Harn, which is this little square right up here off the coast, that's where 90% of the material has been published, is just about that. Up in this area to the northeast of that, you'll see what's kind of the analog to Scandinavia, which in the HârnWorld setting is Ivinia. There's been a number of products published about that as well. But the farther away from Harn you go, the less information has been published. And that's, by design to allow you as the GM to pick, entire regions of the world and develop them on your own without interfering with or without fear of contradicting anything that has been published. So the island of Harn is about twice the size of the British Isles. So it's kind of positioned in the same area, but it's quite a bit larger. I think people have likened it to roughly the same size in acreage as the island of Madagascar. And whereas the northwest part of Lithia, the kingdoms there, if you figure things like France, Germany, the analogs to those, they're considered far more civilized, and Harn is kind of a out of the way, a backwater, a wild, dangerous land. There is civilization there, but it's considered considerably more dangerous and wild than most places in the civilized lands of the continent. But just because it's off to the, up by itself and isolated and wild, it doesn't mean that, it's a boring place to be. Harn is a land of feudal kingdoms and religious turmoil, monsters, knights, peasants, craftsmen, the whole shebang as far as what you're looking for in a fantasy role-playing environment. So I'll let Marc do some talking here too, but we'll talk about some aspects of the HârnWorld setting, or not the setting itself, but the island of Harn and the world itself. What kind of, when you're looking for a fantasy role-playing world, here's what Harn has to offer. Marc, you want to take some of this?
Yeah, so I'd like to just, excuse me, start with the civilized nations. There's 7 different human nations, and they all have a very different character to them. So several of them are feudal, but they're at sort of different stages of feudalism. You have like Meldrin and Kaldor, which are very sort of staid and well-developed feudalism. Candé is much, sort of much newer to the game, and has some sort of pre-feudal aspects to it. Retham is feudalism done wrong, which is great because it's instead of the holdings of the vassals being spread out to keep them from being able to consolidate power, they're in big chunks, and so the resulting politics of that is that you've got these sort of large blocks where you have earls jockeying for power, and it's a situation that's rife for all sorts of armed conflict. Once you get away from the civilized nations, you get into the tribal nations, and they range a wide variety of different cultures. Some are sort of warrior cultures, some are more mystic cultures. It's really sort of intriguing because if you want a character that's from somewhere else or has a different sort of belief system but is still human, there's plenty of opportunity for that. Elves and dwarves are in the setting, and each has their own sort of separate kingdom, but they're fairly insular and fairly isolated. And so if you want those as elements in your game, they're there for you. If you don't, they're easy to sort of partition off to the side and make rare or mysterious as best fits the kind of game you want to run. Creatures, oh man, there's one of the gods of the Harnic pantheon is Ilvir, who is a sort of creator god, and one of his aspects is that he creates. He's an experimenter, a tinkerer, and so he'll create some new organism and just let it loose in the world, and so you have these all sorts of weird monsters, some of which are completely unique, wandering around the island. So if you have a favorite monster in whatever bestiary or monster manual or whatever it is that you want to bring in to the setting, you have the perfect sort of rationalization for that. You can say, well, it is a creature of Ilvir. One of the things that sort of gets people is the craft guild system. Um, it's while Harn has many Earth analogs, Harn is not Earth, and so there's this. There are a few sort of anachronisms, things where the technology isn't as advanced as Earth, or where are certain aspects are more advanced than Earth. So one of those is in the craft guild system, where there's a lot of organization that in our history doesn't come about until about the 14th 15th century. You're talking like early Renaissance kind of stuff. But it's cool because it brings in all sorts of interesting social and economic conflicts that you can use to sort of throw at your players for interesting adventures. So the other aspect of the game that sort of gets people is magic. The setting was designed that it was not magic weak, but that magic was subtle. So the wizards have their own sort of organization, probably called the Shekvar, and they have sort of long since realized that the key to their continued survival is to not alienate the regular populace, because if they do that, the torches and pitchforks come out and it goes badly for everybody. So as a result, magic tends to be very subtle and very mysterious. And when we talk later about how to sort of change the world for your game setting or game rules, or your game rules for the world, we'll delve into that in a little bit more detail. And then the last thing I wanted to throw out there is that the pantheon, the belief system of the various nations and peoples of the region is, in my opinion, one of the most interesting parts of the setting, because a lot of thought is given to the religions in terms of, why would someone believe this? And if someone does believe this, how does that color, how they view the world, or how they act, or, how they approach certain situations? The churches in Harn feel like very human institutions. And yeah, okay, so yeah, we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail.
No, go ahead, keep going on that.
Oh, okay. So yeah, the pantheon is, I think, really interesting because it covers the sort of broad sphere of human experience, right? So you've got your gods of fire and war and healing and magic and all the sort of common things that we think of in a medieval fantasy game, but they have their own sort of worldviews, and it gives a really interesting, morally relativist perspective, where even within a single religion, not everyone agrees on what is true, quote unquote true. So the religions are sort of woven into the fabric of the societies, and they're woven into the fabric of the conflicts that occur in those societies, which I think is a really interesting aspect of the setting. Brent, is there anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, and that's because these are real, we try to portray religions not as stereotypes that, there is if there's a god of thieves, it's not cartoony. There's rationale for things that the churches and the gods we try to portray them in a nuanced way, not just kind of cookie cutter from like a lot of other settings and things. So Marc, the religion, the politics the same way that the governments, the different kingdoms, the different realms of Harn, and how we've written them, how they're portrayed in the text, that they're not all the same. Marc talked a little bit about that before with the different, even the feudal kingdoms aren't all at the same stage of development in a feudal system. That they have differences, some more sophisticated than others. And that's something that we try to do in the different kingdom modules is, when we outline the government, we explain, how the government works and who are the people who are in charge of different parts of the government. It's not just, the king making all the decisions. The king has, people who report to him. Essentially, we show you the org chart for the kingdom, for the top levels. We give you names of people and who's responsible for what and that sort of thing, so that it helps drive conflict. As everything, we try to throw conflict and adventure hooks in everything we do to provide GMs with a lot of opportunities. And by kind of naming those people and giving you an idea of what some of those, what some of their motivations are, why they do the things they do, it helps the GM kind of flesh out their plans, and also use some of those people as NPCs that either as benefactors or antagonists to their game. So those are some of the aspects of the HârnWorld setting, and now I'm going to get a little more specific into, Marc mentioned a number of the kingdoms, and I want to give a little bit of an overview of what the HârnWorld setting offers in terms of the different kingdoms and the other cultures. So if you see this map, the areas that are in gray are they're the civilized realms. So we've got 3 kind of clustered together over here. We've got some that are isolated on this side, and we'll explain why they were designed in that manner in just a minute. So all this green is wilderness, and these red labels in there are the different barbarian tribal nations that we mentioned. So there's 18 of these tribal nations spread throughout. So anywhere you go, anywhere you try to travel, there's a lot of wilderness, unless you stick just within one kingdom itself, pretty much. And all of these little labels up through here and over here, you can't tell on this map, but this is where mountains tend to be. I was around the top of the lake and down the side and down here. And all of these little labels are orc colonies. So over in the east, we have Kaldor, Chibissa, and Meldurin. These 3 kingdoms are among the older ones on the island of Harn. And Kaldor was designed as kind of your traditional medieval kingdom. And it's got no civilized neighbors, as you can see here. It has no borders with anyone else directly. So the game creators kind of designed that as an inward focused part of the setting. The king is old and sickly, he has no heir, and that means big potential for civil war. So if you're looking to run a campaign that is focused on diplomacy or civil war, or like the noble houses jockeying for position and that sort of thing, if you want to run something like that where you don't have to worry about outside pressure from neighboring kingdoms and things, then Meldurin is a good choice for that type of game, or Kaldor is a good choice for that kind of game. Meldurin, down to the southeast, is known as the Wizard's Isle, and there's a lot of shadowy politics. There's a council of mages that advises the king. A lot of the esoteric organizations, so the different convocations of magic use, the Guild of Arcane Lore, those sorts of things, tend to be more powerful in Meldurin than they are anywhere else on Harn. So if you're looking to run a game that is more potentially more high magic, or has just more involvement in that realm, Meldurin is a good place for that. But at the same time, one of the religious orders, one of the fighting orders, that has a base right down along in this part of northern Meldurin, is waging essentially a genocidal crusade against the Solori barbarians. So that's just another aspect. If you want to use Meldurin, there's there's that going on. And Chibissa is this tiny little kingdom nestled here in the crook of this river. It's between Kaldor and Meldurin. It has been in its history part of both of those kingdoms at one time or another, but is currently independent, but is, you know, you can make that as on shaky ground as you want it to be. So it's, you know, caught between its bigger neighbors, but it's also surrounded by barbarians, including the Pagalan, who are a very aggressively dangerous batch of barbarians. So that's another, you know, people sometimes this is a good place to start from a campaign perspective because it is small, and so it may be more manageable for new GMs to kind of wrap their head around the kingdom in general.
Yeah, it gives a very local feel.
So over in the west, we have Rethum, Candé, and the Thardic Republic, a three-way border here. And when the original designers were putting this together, you know, the Candé and Rethum are good examples of stereotypical good with a capital G and evil with a capital E kingdoms. You know, if you wanted to play them in a very black and white manner, you could. There's a lot, they're written with a lot more nuance that not everybody in the good kingdom is good and not everybody in the evil kingdom is evil. But you can take that as far as you want one way or the other. But that's how it was designed, as a religious war kind of brewing on the border, that there were, the two kingdoms were at war not long ago, and there are elements within the kingdom that are essentially refusing to honor the peace that was nailed down a couple of decades ago. So that's one aspect of the HârnWorld setting, is that everything that we write tends to be, as I mentioned earlier, we try to put in adventure hooks everywhere we can, but there's a lot of, you'll notice as we're talking, you know, we're mentioning a lot of potential for conflict, and it was written as potential. So there are, in a lot of these kingdoms, there are things that are about to happen or could happen soon. So while there's no active war going on, it could spark tomorrow, if that's when you, the GM, wanted it to happen. So there's a lot of skirmishing going on between these religious organizations on the Candé-Rethum border. Now, that skirmishing could blow up into a full-scale war, or it could just continue as low-level skirmishing, depending on how you as the GM want to take that. And the third part of that triangle in the west is the Thardic Republic. And that is Marc's specialty. Marc, why don't you talk a little bit about the Thardic Republic?
Yeah, so the Thardic Republic is, a lot of people sort of do it as a shortcut to Rome, but it's actually kind of Rome in reverse, where Rome was a republic that became an empire. Tharda was an empire that has become a republic. So after the collapse of the Corani Empire and the sort of chaos that followed during a religious pogrom, there was no one who was willing to let anybody else be in charge, and so they came up with a sort of power sharing agreement. It's a very interesting and unique form of government, and it's an interesting and unique culture. And if you're looking for a setting that is different than your sort of stereotypical, in the name of the king kind of a feudal setting, Tharda is a really good place to be. The politics there are interesting, and there's just a lot going on there.
Okay, and the remaining three kingdoms are Orbal up in the north, Azadmir in the mountains of the east, and Ivael in the forest of south central Harn. Orbal is Vikings. If you're playing if you're playing a game that you want to do anything with Vikings, Orbal is the place to be. It's not where the Vikings are from, it's where they have conquered. So if I went back to that, one of my first slides where I showed you that Scandinavian style area up to the northeast, that's where the Vikings came from, and they have come down and raided and conquered northern Harn. So you have Vikings plus oppressed peasants, and that leads to rebellion. There have been rebellions in the past that were brutally squashed, but the last one was about 16, 17 years ago. So you as a GM can, you can decide, there's one that could erupt tomorrow if you wanted to just start right in the middle of the action, or you could have the PCs be involved in building to a rebellion. One of the angles there, though, is that although the indigenous population is vastly outnumber the conquerors, they're also very disorganized. They're very independent. Nobody is in charge or wants anybody else to be in charge. So you have a number of little rebellion groups that each want to, run the show, or each want to act independently. So it's kind of gives you as the GM a lot of opportunities for developing that, and your players to develop that into a full-scale rebellion if that's the direction you want to go. Or if you want to have if the players are Vikings, that's a great place for raiding and trading across other parts of Harn. Now, Marc mentioned that elves and dwarves do have a place in the HârnWorld setting, and each of those as a kingdom. So I mentioned that up in the northeast, up in the mountains, you have Azadmir, which is the dwarven kingdom, and Avail is the kingdom of the Sindarin, or elves. And they're both isolated. They're both easily bypassed or integrated in the game in other ways, and we'll be talking about that in a little bit. And you'll notice here that I've got the covers of the products, and have these very nice covers that Richard Luschek, our artist, did actually just last year, added these nice covers. The Thardic Republic has not been updated and revised. We've got a couple of the kingdoms that, well, let me step back. And all of these kingdoms had modules published back in the 1980s. And about 10, 15 years ago, Columbia Games started revising and expanding those kingdom modules, usually on the order of about 4 times what it was, 4 times the length it was back in the 80s. So all of these have been updated and revised. Tharda is on track for either late this year or early next year. So when it's done, it will get a nice cover like the rest of them. And Azadmir is being revised and updated as we speak, and should actually be published. The new version should be published within the next month or so.
Yeah, and that's a huge expansion over the information that was there previously.
Yep. Okay, we've talked about in between the kingdoms, the barbarians, the orcs, and the monsters. And as Marc said, that the monsters, by being kind of the creations of the creator tinker god, it's a mechanism for GMs to drop in whatever they'd like to. So, a little overview of the Harn product line, how it's designed for you as a GM to use things in your game. Now, obviously, since we've been publishing since 1983, there is a ton of stuff out there, and people often feel overwhelmed by just how much information there is about HârnWorld that has been published. But the way that the product line is designed is a very modular system, so that and things are covered in varying degrees of detail. So when you're starting, there are some pretty obvious places that we can say, well, these are the first things you really need to do, because they kind of give you that high level of information. And then there's another step down and another step down. So the HârnWorld master module, which is this one up here, and HârnDex, which is the master index and glossary, and like an encyclopedia. Those are really good places to start, because they give you that really high level of information about the setting. But then we have individual kingdom modules, as we've seen, adventure modules, books about magic and religion, things like shipping and maritime rules, manor management and design, maps of all sorts. So we have a lot of different types of articles, a lot of types of modules, but they while they are all consistent and they all kind of build on each other, you don't have to have everything to get started. And we'll go into that where to start. We'll get into that in just a little bit. But the HârnWorld master module has an overall, it's a good introductory book for the region. It has the history of Harn, covers in a high level of detail cultures and trade, religion, how feudal governments work, how the manorial economic system works. It has price lists, income lists for various occupations. It has a weather generation chart. So if you're looking for that basic where to start, the HârnWorld master module is the place to go for that high level information. And then the next level down is the Harndex, which, as I mentioned, it's an encyclopedia. So it's listed alphabetically, entries here for geographical features, culture and political entities. So the deities, the religious orders, the economic issues, guild topics, that sort of thing. So each of the cities would have information, a little bit of information about it. So I'll zoom in here and kind of show you, we've got a mountain, we've got one of the rebel groups up in Orbal, we have one of the gods, Agric, we have a bit about the city of Coronan. Each of these things, they're just different pages. This one would be a historical entry that talks about one of the periods in Harn's development, weights and measures. So all that sort of thing is covered in the Harndex. And the next level down of detail is the kingdom module. So each kingdom then takes a limited geographical area and expands on those same topics: history, politics, government, economics, religion, all that stuff for just that kingdom. So it's the information that was done in brief in Harndex is now detailed in the kingdom module, and a lot of plot hooks of how to use that kingdom in your game. So in the examples here, each of the major settlements in the kingdom has a page that explains. So this is the castle of Gardirin. This lists out all of the lands that the Earl of Neff, who is based at Gardirin. So these are all the lands that the Earl controls, and it tells you where they are, who holds it for him, the number of acres, the land quality, the number of households. So there's an awful lot of information that you can glean from here. And in the text, we have a lot of information about the Earl and his earldom, and a lot of hooks there that you can use to kind of drive your game. And each of the kingdoms has one of those. And inside a kingdom, there are settlement articles. And for, again, a smaller geographical area, we delve into those same topics: history, politics, government, economics, religion, and just give you a much greater detail than at that settlement level. So this is the article for Gardirin, the seat of the Earl of Neff that I just showed. So we have a lot of really good artwork in there. We have the floor plans for the castle and potentially some other locations, descriptions of village locations, descriptions of the castle, lots of floor plans and maps, and of course, more plot hooks.
Yeah, the goal.
Yeah, go ahead, Mark.
Just wanted to jump in. The goal for pretty much all of these articles is that you should be able to pick up any article and open it to pretty much any page, and there will be some plot hook there that you can pick up and run with more or less immediately.
So outside of the settlements, outside of geography, there are a ton of different articles to illustrate various aspects of the world setting. So there's bestiary articles. There are articles about trade routes, wilderness areas, the various organizations like the religious orders and fighting orders, and also cultural things like law and hunting and heraldry, real estate, how to run a household, manor economics. There are a lot of stuff. So if you are interested in a topic, there's a really good chance that there's an article about it. And if there's something you're interested in that we don't have an article, there might be someday, and maybe you're the one who can help us write that. So all of these articles, all these supporting articles contain more plot hooks. So just by thumbing through the law article, could give you all sorts of ideas of fun things, fun situations to put your PCs in. And the maps, there's tons of maps. And from the region map, now you'll get, for being here today, you'll get the copy, the PDF of the Harn region map, which is the island as a whole. And then there are these Atlas Harnica maps, which are the squares. So actually, if I jump back to here, you'll notice the squares, if you can see them, they're squares marked on this map. So if I look at, say, D9, which is the tip here of Candé, that square has a map just for it. Right. Where'd it go? One more. Sorry about that. This right here is that map of D9. And it shows a whole lot of detail about that one little square on the region map. So it shows you the castle of Sarkum and keep at Hebon. And these are all manors around it. And then this is, the moors, and it's got contours, and it's got mountain peaks and that sort of stuff. So that's the level of detail that the Atlas Harnica maps get down to. And then there are the maps for individual settlements, and then the floor plans of major buildings inside. So Marc, why don't you talk about, now that we've kind of given an overview of the product line and the setting, an overview of now that I know what Harn is, what can I do with it? What are the types of games that I can run there?
Right. So I think one of the strengths of the setting is that it opens up so many different opportunities for, the kind of game you want to run. So the question we get most frequently is, where do I start? And we always end up answering that question with a question, which is, what kind of game do you want to run? Because the setting is so varied, you can support a lot of different kinds of playstyle. If your players are into, internecine, backstabbing, political intrigue, then, a place like Caldor or Retham that's on the brink of a civil war would be great. If they want to just, be involved in the fighting and they want to wreck stuff, well, then they can either be involved in a holy war between the Agricans and Loranians, or, perhaps they could be Viking raiders or resisting Viking raiders. There's lots of options for the standard sort of dungeon crawl kind of things, because littered throughout the setting are these mysterious ruins from some, barely known and sort of little understood precursor civilization. And so exploring, finding and exploring those is an option if you wanted to go for sort of more traditional, dungeon delving experience. And one of the aspects of those ancient precursor ruins is that most of them have what are called godstones, which are these, perhaps magical, perhaps advanced technological, not clear and up to the GM essentially, transport devices, which is great because that lets you link into the concept of, gaming across a multiverse. So if you have an existing campaign and your players are, in some setting, Greyhawk, Forgotten Realms, Eberron, whatever, they can come across one of these objects and, boom, all of a sudden, now they're in Harn. And now perhaps the adventure is, how do they get back? So that's here it is, the fantasy Stargate kind of idea. The other sort of toggle that we have is, do you want to go high fantasy or do you want to go low fantasy? because the setting can support both. It's not that magic is weak; it's that magic tends to be fairly rare. But an organization within the Convocation of Wizards that's called the Gentle Order of the White Hand, and their job is to hunt down renegade wizards before those renegade wizards cause trouble for everybody else. So, that's a situation where if you wanted to have your PCs all playing magic users, and basically being, a magical hit squad, that's very high fantasy, but it's something that is built into the setting. Or if you want to go the complete opposite end, you can have a very sort of low magic, low power level campaign. I had a game that I ran for many years that was a gritty urban crime drama. So the players were all related. They were all family, and they were all members of the same thieves guild. And that was very much a local, low fantasy, kind of, very gritty sort of a campaign. So all of these different ways of playing are supported by the setting, because the setting hangs together well. It's very internally consistent, and there's a lot of realism built into it. So when you're trying to decide what situations to pose to the players, the information is there at your fingertips. And then once your players do something, when you're trying to figure out how the world around them responds to their actions, that information is there as well. Brent, is there anything you wanted to add?
Nope. I think there's some things we'll touch on a little bit later about that. But now that I know a little bit about the island of Harn, I know what kind of that a lot of different types of campaigns are possible. If I'm not using Harn Master, and because we talked earlier at the very beginning that Harn Master is not required to use the HârnWorld setting. If I'm using something else, how do I make that work?
Yeah, so it's important to note that the Harn setting came out before Harn Master. So, a lot of people think, well, if I'm playing Harn, I have to use Harn Master. But there were, several years where, there wasn't a Harn Master. And so my first game in the setting of Harn was with first edition AD&D. And that was back in the, mid to late 80s, I think. Since then, I've run games using third edition Shadowrun. Most recently, I've been using a variation on Apocalypse World. It really is a system agnostic setting, which I think is really neat. But for whatever system you have, you may have to do a little bit of tinkering to match your rule set to the setting. A lot of times that's something where if you're taking a rule system that's not necessarily designed for medieval fantasy and making a few alterations to make it support medieval fantasy. So for instance, I said that I had used the Shadowrun system. Shadowrun is great for, it's a sort of sci-fi game. It's great if you have a lot of different variability in firearms, but there's no firearms in this particular medieval fantasy setting. So what I had to do is take Shadowrun's single, quote unquote melee combat skill and break that up into multiple skills. So I could distinguish between someone who was good with using a sword versus using a spear versus using daggers or whatever. So sometimes you'll have to do a little bit of tinkering there. But if you're coming from a system that already uses or already sort of assumes a medieval fantasy genre like AD&D or Pathfinder or any of these other sort of commonly played systems that your players are probably familiar with, you'll find there's very little that you actually have to do for the basic mechanics. The two regions where you start to get into having to do a little bit more tinkering are magic and religions. So in magic, the setting of HârnWorld, the way magic works, there are 6 convocations, and these convocations are these general sort of spheres of magic. So like say, fire magic versus water magic. They're sort of elemental, but they sort of reach outside what we sort of standardly think of as the 4 or 5 sort of classic elements. you know, for instance, mind is one of the Pavaric elements. Um, so that's sort of built into the setting where different schools of magic studied different aspects of the arcane arts. What I found when I was porting Shadowrun over is that I could just go through the spell list and I could say, oh, well, this spell belongs in this convocation and this spell belongs in this other convocation, and separate them that way. And then, you know, if a mage was casting a spell for the convocation that he studied, he got a bonus. If he was casting a spell for a convocation that was, you know, the sort of opposite side of the elemental spectrum from him, he would get a penalty. And so it was very easy to sort of map things out that way. I know in D&D there are sort of classes of magic like, you know, illusion or invocation, evocation, or divination or whatever. You could also do it that way. And you say, oh, well, my convocation now is a different group of magic. And then instead of taking your rules and mapping them to the setting, you can take the setting and say, all right, I'm not going to do the standard Pavaric elements. I'm going to just do different schools of magic that are supported in my existing rules, but I keep that same sort of setting detail that different mages study different things, and bring that in directly without having to change my rules. So you can do that sort of mapping as well. Now, one of the things I think that is important is that you know, in the setting is the idea that magic is subtle, and that you know, everyone's sort of nervous of renegades who are openly using magic. I think that's an interesting check on, you know, quote unquote caster supremacy, that puts a little bit of a limit on the power of magic that's imposed by the setting, if not by the rules. So I think that covers it mostly for the things you'll want to keep in mind for magic. And if anyone has specific questions, we can take those as well. So I'm going to move on to religions. And in religions, as we mentioned earlier, you know, they're very sort of realistic and human institutions. But you could very easily drop the, you know, each of the 10 gods in the pantheon into an alignment bucket. You know, so you could say, okay, well, this is, you know, Morgath is the god of chaos, disease, and undeath. Perfect map to, you know, a chaotic evil god. Lorani is the goddess of chivalry and feudalism and defending the poor and the meek. So that maps perfectly to lawful good. I think that does a little bit of a disservice to the religions because they're more nuanced than that. But if you just want to, you know, use what's there, it's a very easy fit. So it wouldn't take, you know, much thought on the part of the GM to say, this is how I'm going to, you know, distribute these different gods into different alignment paths. One interesting aspect of the religion in the setting is that, much like magic, it should be subtle. Most of the sort of ritual invocations that are a part of the religions have effects that are also very subtle. And so there's always this idea of, was it a coincidence or was it a miracle? And who knows? It's a matter of faith, right? So this idea that that quote unquote spell casting for a religion, you know, for a cleric or whatever, may have a different feel than, you know, your standard sort of the heavens open, light shines down, and, you know, your enemies are smote by the power of God. It's a different, it's, I think, a different feel, which
I think, well, and I think another aspect to that is that, you know, when we're writing something, we're writing it with not the absence of magic and you know, magical and religious thinking, but we try to keep things fairly low scale so that, as I mentioned earlier about Caldor, that the king is old and sickly and has no heirs. And to some people, it's like, well, he's the king. How can he be sick if he's got, as the king, he has the wealth of the kingdom at his disposal and the power of the kingdom at his disposal. Why wouldn't he have, a cleric just come and heal him? Why, how can the king have been, sick for 20 years? It's like, well, because that's, from a design perspective, we want that. We don't want the magical aspects or the fantastical elements of the system to kind of overpower the realistic aspects of the system. So as a GM, that's a really good question for you to think about and for you to answer, that it's like, well, gee, why would the king still be sick? If it's, as Marc was talking about here, the, miracles that, well, is it a matter of faith? Is it that the king is, the king's faith isn't strong enough that the gods have, that one of the gods who have been petitioned, haven't healed him? Is there something that's blocking magical healing? There's a lot of opportunities for you as the GM to kind of explain that sort of thing if you want magical and religious healing and those sorts of things to be to have a stronger place in your campaign.
Yeah, there was somebody who did a great write-up a couple of years ago about how the reason that Megadeth was still sickly and hadn't passed yet was because he was actually undead, and no one had caught on to it yet. And so, the campaign wasn't what happens when the king dies. It's, oh my God, what happens when people find out the king is undead? Really interesting twist on the situation.
Yep.
All right, so you want to take this one?
Let's talk a little bit about non-humans and their place in a setting that kind of is focused on, realism.
Okay, so yes, the way that that the non-human races are written within the setting is, it'll be familiar to anybody who's kind of versed in the Tolkienian medieval fantasy setting, but they all have a sort of different twist to them, or something that sets them apart and makes them a little bit unique. And so if you want to have elves and dwarves in your setting, it's certainly doable. But one of the things I really enjoy about the setting is that it puts the sort of, elder races in into a context that is just utterly alien, because they're not human. Even just the span of life that they cover is going to give them different views on things. They're going to approach problems in a different way. Where the elf is going to say, well, this isn't a problem. We just wait 2 or 3 centuries and this will solve itself. That's something that's not super helpful from a human perspective. So this idea that of the alienness of these other races is sort of built into the setting, to the point where in the new version of Azadmir, we go into a little bit more detail about the difference in just the physiology of the dwarves and how that affects how they approach solving or dealing with a particular problem. Now, if you don't want to have these demi-human races or non-human races in your setting, that's certainly doable. I know, Brent, you mentioned that in your game, you had the elves and the dwarves as human kingdoms that were just really insular and didn't like outsiders.
Yeah, it was just my way of, because I didn't like, when I was running this was many years ago, I didn't like the idea of elves and dwarves, but they were there, they were on the map, they were in the book, there was a kingdom there, or kingdoms there. And so, the way I handled it was, okay, well, they're just human cultures, that they're no less human. They're, by being isolated, they kind of lend themselves to a kind of quasi-legendary status that, you know, in a true medieval environment, you know, if you're trying to go realistic, you know, your average person rarely or never travels from their manor. You know, they're in one town, or, you know, they might visit the neighboring village or the neighboring town, that sort of thing. But long distance travel was fairly rare, unless you are a caravan mercenary or a trader or somebody that travels long distance. So for the most part, people in the Harnic realms had heard about these other places, but hearing about, if you're a peasant in Kaldor, hearing about or knowing, well, there's a place called Retham way out west, and, you know, that's where the evil people live, or there's this place up in the mountains called Azadmir, and that's where the dwarves live. Now, those dwarves are in the way I had it, those dwarves were no less human, but they had that kind of legendary status of being something other than human. And so it always made for fun when, you know, when the players on the occasion that they finally met a dwarf, and it was like this kind of, you know, of course the players at the time that I was playing with, you know, they were expecting, you know, Tolkien's dwarves, and
Gimli.
here they just met somebody that was like, oh, wait a minute, you're just a person. You know, it was kind of this, you know, and I had them culturally different. So he talked different. He was a little shorter because he was, you know, their different aspects to their culture and things kind of lended itself to it. But in any case, you know, the long story short, you know, you can use the Harnic elves and dwarves as Tolkien-esque as you would like, or not, that they can be ignored because they're isolated communities. You can convert them to human, or you can use them as, you know, kind of standard right out of the book D&D elves and dwarves. Okay, these are good topics that, Mark, I know you like to talk about, the role that treasure plays in standard role playing, and some of the aspects of that may not work so great with the Harn setting, and how to deal with that.
Yeah. So one of the first things that's interesting about the setting, I find, is that it uses a silver standard rather than a gold standard, meaning that, you know, if you have money in the form of coinage, it tends to be in silver pieces. This is actually fairly historically accurate. That silver was the common currency for most of the medieval period. But what I think is interesting is that the setting is often described as, you know, quote unquote, money poor, meaning there's not a lot of coinage out there. And what coinage there is tends to be concentrated in areas where there's a lot of commerce. So you tend to be like in urban centers, you'll have more coinage. It's something that's less common sort of out in the wilderness. So, okay, yeah, you've cleared out some colony of orcs. There's probably not going to be mountains of coins in there, because who brings coins out into the wilderness, right? Like nobody. So one of the things I think is really fascinating about the setting is that the way that you reward players oftentimes is not with cash, it's with other things. And those other things come with their own strings attached. So for instance, the Thieves Guild game that I ran, one of their biggest scores was that they snagged a wagon load of Anzalorian hardwood. They knew that it was valuable, but they didn't know, what to do with it. So part of the adventure was getting it, and then the next part of the adventure was getting rid of it and turning it into something that they could use, cash or whatever. So there's the price lists that's in the is that in HârnDex or I think it's in the HârnWorld.
Yeah, it's in HârnWorld.
Yeah, in HârnWorld is great because, okay, so you have done a service for the villagers. They reward you with a half dozen chickens. Okay, like that has a monetary value to it, but now you have a half dozen chickens. What do you do with that? And so it just gives the GM lots of opportunities to just mess with the players and give them something that sort of subverts their expectations, or give them a reward where the reward is in and of itself the first step on to the next adventure. It also gives the GM tools to limit, such that the PCs aren't just rolling around with enough cash to, buy cities and towns. So, and then of course, the other aspect is, we sort of derisively refer to the murder hobo, which is the adventurer who goes from town to town, randomly murdering people and taking their stuff. One of the things I think the setting does a really good job of is making it clear that actions have consequences. So, if you get in a bar fight and a guy gets knifed, well, that guy, he has a family, he has a job, he lives in a particular place, he has friends, he has a liege lord, he has somebody who is theoretically responsible for his safety. And so this idea that you can just, roll up and, start knifing people really doesn't translate well. And so the setting gives the GM lots of opportunities to again, subvert expectations about how the world works and how, what the PC's role within it is. I always say follow the money, because someone somewhere is going to be negatively impacted by something that the PCs are doing. And those people have power and they want to stay in power. And so they will do what they need to do to maintain that power. And if that means, chasing the PCs out of town with a posse of people wielding torches and pitchforks, then that's cool too. Is there anything you wanted to add about that?
Yeah, actually, that there is that. So I got to thinking about this yesterday as we were talking about it, and the illustration that I've got next to murder hobos here is a really good example of, if you as a GM want to, if that style of play is something that you and your players are interested in, you can make it work in the HârnWorld setting to a degree. That illustration comes from an article that we put out a year or so ago about one of the fighting orders. So it's a religious organization. It's a fighting order of the god Ogric, who is the evil god of war and fire and that sort of thing. And so this illustration are people in the setting. They are members of the cohorts of Gashang, the fighting order. And the way, if you read that article, you could come away from it thinking, well, those guys are just sanctioned murder hobos. They're in charge of an area, and they've kind of, they dominate that area, and they have conflicts with, their neighboring areas and stuff. So if you wanted, if you as a GM and your players want to actually play kind of a very, violent, no rules type group, great. There are places in Harn that you can actually do that. But as Marc was just talking about here, you've got to take into account that their actions are going to have consequences. That organization in general, or in specific that the cohorts of Gashang, they're on the border of Retham and the Thardic Republic, and the land that they hold was stolen from the Thardic Republic, and the Republic has legions. There's negotiations underway to return the land to the Republic, and there's a whole lot of politics going on. There's a whole lot of things going on in that area that you could involve your players in, knowingly or unknowingly. That there are things going on behind the scenes that they wouldn't be aware of, and their actions as murder and mayhem could be throwing a monkey wrench in somebody else's plans, and that could negatively affect them, or at least make things very interesting.
Yeah, I think it's a really good way to introduce realism to the setting. You know, I mean, it's a it it puts in a very clear sort of cause and effect kind of thing, which makes for natural, organic conflicts and stories to happen.
Yep. Okay, so I know we're running over already, so I want to touch back on something Marc brought up earlier about okay, now that I know about Harn and I know about all the different aspects of the setting and how I might use it in my own with my own rules and that sort of thing, the question of, with all this detail, where in the world do I start? And we hear that a lot, and I personally, I tend to get annoyed when people just kind of the knee-jerk reaction that a lot of people give to that is, oh, well, just start in Caldor because that's where the most stuff is. And that really annoys me on a couple levels, because one, Caldor's never been my favorite place. But more than that, it's, as Marc said, that question needs to be answered not with an answer, but with more questions. That, well, what are you trying to do? What is it you enjoy? What is it your players enjoy? What kind of game are you wanting to run? Because if you asked me, where do I start? And I said Caldor, and in the back of your mind, you're thinking, well, I want to run something about Vikings. Well, Caldor is completely not really the right place to do that. So there is no one answer to the question, where do I start? It all depends on what you're looking for. The list that we went through a little bit ago of those different types of campaigns, and we showed that there are examples of a lot of different places that you could do each of those. So don't worry about picking the right place, that's the same as everybody else's right place, because there isn't one. So in the HârnWorld Master Module, we give you one page about each of the kingdoms that kind of really boils that down to the essence of, well, gives you a good idea of what goes on in this kingdom. What is the flavor of this kingdom? What kind of stuff could I do there? And start there. Pick one place. Pick a kingdom, pick a city. If a more urban style adventure is something that you're looking to do, pick a place and grow from there. Don't worry about having to have everything that's ever been published. You don't. As a GM, it's you're making this stuff up, or you're reading it. Your players may not even know. So the HârnWorld Master Module, the Harndex is an invaluable resource, because it is that encyclopedic overview of people, places, things, historical events. There's a lot of information in the Harndex that if you set your game in Retham and a question comes up about something in Caldor, you can just look it up in the Harndex and say, okay, yeah, there's a couple sentences about the castle of Monarsis, but that's really all I need right now. And so you can start from one place and expand out from there as your campaign grows, or as you changes locations and that sort of thing. And we don't be afraid to, I see people on the Harn forum, mentioning things about, well, I don't want to go there yet because I haven't purchased, all 18 castles from Caldor. So I don't want to go there because I might do something wrong. And there is no wrong. It's, your game is your game. We put out what we put out as a starting point, but we expect that people will, in their own use, they're going to use the things that fit, and they're going to change what doesn't fit. If you want to have the lord of some castle have a completely different personality than what he's written up as in the official article, that's fine. Do that. There was, a debate on the Harn forum recently about that, where somebody was saying, oh, well, that's out of character for so-and-so. It's like, but yeah, that's what it worked. But in my game, that's what I needed for there to be. I needed somebody to do it this way because that's how it was going to work for my story. So, that's use what fits, change what doesn't, and enjoy it. And, that's that's kind of up to the GM to use the Harn material in a way that really fits. And somebody on the chat just a bit ago was talking about that, they don't use the Harn setting as a whole, but they'll adopt bits and pieces where they'll take, one of the cities, and in their own world that they're using, they'll drop that city down as one of the cities on that map. And they'll just use the internal logic, the internal details of the city, and ignore any of the stuff that kind of mentions things outside of that.
Yeah, one of the other things that I think we don't necessarily talk about very much is, HârnWorld material as inspiration. If you have any interest whatsoever in world building, the Harn materials, I think, are a really good example of how to do it. I mean, it's one of the joys of the setting that it has. I mean, it has stuff from the top down. I mean, there are star charts, there's an astrology article, there's tides and tectonic movements and weather charts and all the kind of stuff that really goes to making a world feel real. And then you get into the political and the religious institutions and how to make everything hang together. If you want to create your own setting, maybe grab a couple articles at different levels of detail and go nuts. Use it as inspiration for your own thing.
So once you've dug in and immersed yourself in, one part of the setting and expanded to the other parts of Harn, and even if you, went from this kingdom to that kingdom to another kingdom, at some point there's the lands beyond the island of Harn. And as I mentioned early on, there's a little bit of detail about some of that and a little more detail about a little bit of it. So Ivinia, the Scandinavia of the setting, there's the region module, and 2 kingdoms have been published, and there's more being developed now. Lithia, the continent, there's a 32-page encyclopedia type article about that gives a paragraph or 2 about each of the major kingdoms or realms of the Lithian continent. And again, like Harn, it's kind of that something for everyone vibe, that if you want, kind of a desert raiders type of thing, there's a place that you can put those. If you want like Silk Road style caravans crossing the desert between, the Far East, and, there's a place that you can drop that in Lithia. There's all sorts of different things, and that Lithia module gives you just a few paragraphs or a few sentences about each of those, just enough to kind of spark your imagination, but also to give you a little bit of information where you can go, oh, okay, well, that's kind of like this real place in the real world. I'll just go do some research about that and kind of make my own way of doing it. And then there's the Godstones, which are, if you don't like that element, they're very non-intrusive. There's only a few of them spread out across the island of Harn. They're all very remote. They're all very hidden. It's not like there's a Godstone on every, street corner, that sort of thing. So they may never come into play in a campaign. I've certainly never run into one in any game that I've been running. But they're there. They're a great mechanism that the original designers put into the system as a way, into the setting as a way to bring in characters from your homebrew world, or as Marc said, from any of the other ones, Greyhawk or Westeros or anything. You can have them as a gateway to and from those locations. So they're just a really good way of teleporting your players between time and space. So I'm sure you have questions. We can answer some of them here. If after today you've got other questions. So the Columbia Games website is columbiagames.com or harn.columbiagames.com if you want to go directly to the Harn material. There's a lot of things there, a lot of the products. There's some information about along the lines of what we've talked about today. There's kind of a view of the products there as well. The fan community is an independent community. It is not officially, associated with Columbia Games, but the fans kind of gather at lithia.com or the Harn forum, which is the discussion forum, lithia.com/forum. Great place to go if you have questions, because there are a lot of Harn nerds there that will be more than happy to answer your question. Of course, you ask a question of 18 people and 18 Harn fans, and you're going to get 19 different answers out of them. But that's all part of the charm of the Harn forum. Is sometimes there's consensus, and sometimes it just really shows the variety in how people have over the years interpreted the published material and kind of run with it in different directions, and how people have used the different products in different ways. And one thing I didn't talk about when we were talking about the product line, I'm going to jump back real quick to that with the, missed it. There we go. Most of the HârnWorld products are sold in print and as PDF. And in print, it's almost everything is done as loose leaf pages, and they're hole punched for you to put in your 3-ring binder. Part of the organization of Harn material is a very personal thing. People kind of arrange them in their own ways. But everything that's published today is available in print or as PDF. Through the Columbia Games website, you can order both of those, but PDFs are also available through DriveThruRPG. Just look for Columbia Games on the publisher list, and you'll see them there. There are, if you're looking to purchase things, most articles are sold individually. So you can just buy the little things that you want, the bits and pieces as you want them. The Columbia does offer a product, or offers a subscription product called HârnQuest, and it's not like a 1-year subscription. It's kind of an open-ended thing. If you're a HârnQuest subscriber, what that really does is it gets you on the list for these quarterly releases, where we will publish usually 4 times a year, 32 pages or so about something or another. It'll be a collection of articles, or in the case of this very next HârnQuest, as Marc mentioned a little bit ago, the Kingdom of Azadmir is being revised, and that's going to be the next HârnQuest release. So if you're a HârnQuest subscriber, it means you're on the list. You get your copy of HârnQuest shipped out to you. You get billed. You'll get billed for it as it comes out. You're not billed up front for the duration of the subscription. You're billed as things come out every quarter. The HârnQuest subscribers, the HârnQuest cost is usually like a 20% or so discount over the retail price of the articles after the fact. You don't have to be a subscriber to buy things. You can buy things individually after they're published, but you do save a little money by being a subscriber. And the big perk for being a subscriber, there's a few, but the biggest perk that I can think of is that as long as you are a HârnQuest subscriber, all back catalog PDFs are 50% off. So you can join HârnQuest today, or subscribe to HârnQuest today, and get the next shipments automatically. But by being a subscriber, you can start going through the back catalog of everything that's been published, and everything that is available as a PDF you can get for 50% off. So it's a really good way to build your collection at a reasonable price. So let me see if there were some other questions here, if other people had some things that we wanted to bring up. I don't know, Marc, if you've been reading these while I've been talking.
Yeah, I have. It's cool that we've got a number of folks in the chat who are already big supporters of the setting. Rob mentioned that he's got all his binders of Harn behind him, and I can see them there in the shot. That was pretty cool.
So somebody I've seen questions about Kickstarters. Columbia has done a couple of Kickstarter campaigns over the last couple of years, and I'm sure that they've got more coming. I am not party to any plans at the moment or anything. I've heard a couple of rumblings of some things, but nothing, definite. But those tend to be pretty good deals. One thing that I will say that, okay, Columbia Games is a small company. Marc and I are not employees of Columbia Games. We're, freelancers who work on, the material that they publish. But Columbia Games itself has, very few employees. It's a small family-run business, and they're really known for, their customer service. And if you have a question about buying things, especially if you missed out on the Kickstarter and are looking to buy, the collections that were made as part of the Kickstarter, give them a call, send them an email, send them a mail, send them a letter. We had somebody yesterday who said they mailed a letter to Columbia Games and were, amazed at how quickly they were responded to. But, you can call them and talk to them and say, hey, look, I'm interested in all of these books that you had as part of the Kickstarter, but I missed out on it. What sort of deal can you offer me today? And, from what I've heard, people have been really successful in getting good deals from Columbia Games along those lines. So I'm not making any promises for them. Like I said, I don't work for them, but I've heard very good results from people who've said that, they have been, able to work with Columbia Games on that sort of thing. If you're looking to make large purchases, that they're pretty good about working with you on that.
Yeah, Grant mentioned a while back that they're working on a campaign manager software that's going to, have essentially like campaign tracking kind of stuff, including like weather tables and whatnot as well. I don't know when that is, when that's slated to come out, but that's one of the things that's sort of in the pipeline.
So, okay. I see there was a message that was to me. It wasn't one that was posted to the group, but. So someone asked, or they said, similar to your, mention that about changing Harn to suit your game and vision, I've heard over the years from players that have voiced a concern that there is no place for them in Harn. These comparisons were to D&D, and that you can carve your own destiny in D&D, like 9th level characters get strongholds and such, but that type of thing isn't inherent to Harn. How would you count those concerns? So, Marc, what do you think about that?
I think a lot of that is on the expectation of the players or the GM on what the arc of the campaign is going to be like. So, for instance, when I run Harn games using Apocalypse World, one of the Apocalypse World playbooks is the Hard Holder, which when I run it in Orbal is the Valhakar. It's the guy who's in charge of the setting or in charge of the settlement. And so that person starts out with a stronghold. They start out with a gang of armsmen. So basically from the very get-go, I can carve out a place for them. I can say, all right, well, in the book it says this guy was the previous Valhakar, but you're the Valhakar now. How did you take power? And then, we start establishing who has something to say about that? How did it change the tributary relationships between who owes you tribute and who you owe tribute to in turn? I think there's so much detail about the political situation that, creating a new manor or a new barony or taking over an existing barony is absolutely within the realm of something you can do in a game set in Harn for other rule sets.
Yeah, and I think that there's people chiming in here on the chat, saying very similar that there's in any of the kingdoms there are ruined manors. There are a lot of unsettled frontiers. And while, you know, if you're using like a level-based system, and it's, you know, one of the things says level, you can establish a stronghold. Okay, well, great. There's nothing in the HârnWorld setting that says that can't happen, but it's not just going to be a magically it just appears and you get it. You know, the setting is designed from a well, make it happen. You know, what do you do to make that happen? That there are ruins that can be reestablished. There is frontier land that can be, you know, carved out. That, you know, make a name for yourself and come to the attention of, you know, the powers that be in a kingdom. And, you know, you might have to show your worth and become, you know, before you're entrusted or given the permission to do that sort of thing. But it's not it's not, you know, turn it into an adventure, turn it into part of the campaign. It doesn't just happen. And similarly, you know, if you're, you know, not, you know, taking a change from the, you know, the fighter type things to, if you are playing a thief type character, there are all sorts of opportunities for setting up your own, you know, crime syndicate, or earning a place in an existing one. Or like you were talking about earlier, Mark, that, you know, you did a full campaign about exactly that. And,
Yeah.
you know, your players didn't start out in control, but that was part of the situation. You know, part of the campaign was that as they became more experienced and more involved and more known in their community, that power was something that they were working towards. But at the same time, the farther they go, the more resistance that there was to them.
Yeah, well, and you know, towards the end of that campaign, you know, one of the PCs had become the sort of, you know, guild master of Coronan, and part of it was interesting to talk to the players at that point, because they're like, well, this, you know, in some ways feels like the end of the campaign, but it also is a brand new beginning to the campaign, because they realized that now they had gotten what they had been working for. It came with a whole different set of trouble, which was great. They became much more involved in, you know, deeper in politics, because now they're not doing, you know, basic thief stuff. They're running the thieves, and there's a lot more intrusions on their time and attention, so to speak.
Yeah, and by having the focus that we do on human organizations, you know, that the religions, the guilds, that even the magic communities, so the, you know, the different order, you know, convocations and chantries and that sort of thing, that by having these human organizations, it really gives the players and the GM a lot of opportunities for PCs earning positions of influence and power. So,
Yeah.
you know, you might start off with a PC who is like, you know, an apprentice or journeyman, a journeyman mage who, you know, is setting, you know, has been serving at a chantry or studying at a chantry for years, and is now ready to, you know, go off into the world and do their own studying and find artifacts and that sort of thing. And they may have the goal of one day running that chantry, or running another one, or establishing a new one somewhere. And those are all things that the HârnWorld setting offers and allows, is that there are a lot of places, a lot of opportunities for PCs to make their mark.
I love the convocations of the Shekvar, because it's like the worst kind of backbiting academia, only with magic. It's so cool.
So we're now at an hour and a half. I want to kind of draw this to a close. Looks like we're, you know, the questions, I hope we've answered your questions today. If you have other questions, well, Mark and I are both on the Harn forum, and we would see your questions if you posted them there. we would be more than happy, along with hundreds of other people, to jump in and give you help and answer any questions you might have. So thanks everybody for attending today. And I hope that you are, I hope your interest in Columbia Games and the HârnWorld setting pay off big dividends down the road for you. So thanks everybody.
Yeah, thanks for jumping in today.